Imagine a crisp, light German Pilsner with the added notes of tropical fruit, citrus, and stone fruit. This is the BJCP provisional style of New Zealand Pilsner. Grab a beer, have a seat, and we're going to teach you how to brew one right after this. This episode is brought to you by the Master Homebrewer Program. Earn awards and badges based upon how you score in homebrewing competitions across the world. Sign up now at cialers.org. Welcome to Mean Brews. Today we're going to cover a BJCP provisional style of New Zealand Pilsner. Imagine combining the light, crisp lager taste of a German Pilsner with the fruity tropical notes of the New Zealand hops. Sounds delicious, doesn't it? I've personally never brewed one, and I've never had one. And when my randomizer selected this, I thought I'd never be able to find anyone that had. However, I was lucky enough to find 5 or 8 recipes out there on the web that had won in competition. So let's dive right into the style and figure out how to brew one. I was able to obtain 8 recipes from across the web and some friends of mine that had won medals out on the competition circuit. 2 of the recipes were gold medal recipes, one of which was a best of show recipe in the UK. We had 3 silver medal winning recipes and 2 bronze medal winning recipes. Style overview. This is a provisional style BJCP X5. The BJCP description is a pale, dry, golden-colored, cleanly fermented beer showcasing the characteristic hop or tropical, citrusy, fruity, grassy New Zealand type hops. Let's see where they are on our stability and variation sliders. I have no idea where this is in stability. This is such a new style. There's no history other than the past couple years of beers being brewed of this style. So give me a few years, maybe I'll revisit this, but right now I can't tell you how the style is evolving or if it is evolving at all. As far as variation between the recipes, there's very little variation, the biggest of which is in water chemistry. I'll show you the water chemistries later and how wide they've interpreted that, from soft to very hard, high levels of gypsum to balanced profiles. I'll make a recommendation later on when we get to the recipe. However, that's the only area where we're seeing some significant variation between the recipes. On the original gravity, the BJCP range is between 1.044 to 1.056. Pretty much they all stayed within that. There were a couple that were outside by 1 point. Data set range from 1.043 to 1.057. The mean was right on the middle of the BJCP style guidelines. IBUs tended to be on the high side. We had a range of 28 to 75 between the highs and the lows, and a mean of 45.2. If you throw out the high-low, that drops to 45. Most of the recipes kind of stayed within this realm right here. So I would recommend, if you're going to come up with a recipe, to keep it between 36 and 45. The color, this is intriguing that the range is so big for BJCP. However, the actual suite of data that we have shows that they stayed on the low side of color. And that's predominantly because they're using just base malts mostly, or carapils. There's not a lot of dark colored malts, if any at all, that go into this recipe. So we're about, 2.5 to 4 SRM or 4.9 to 7.8 EBC. When you take an average of, what's in the malt bill of every recipe of the all 8, 95.9 or 96% were base malts. 4% were crystal malts, and 0.3% toast malts. Not a big difference. Kind of fits with the German Pilsner style as well. Base malt proportions, we'll start with, the vertical axis on this plot. The percentage of recipes that use these base malts. Excuse me. The highest percentage was Pilsner. It's a Pilsner beer, so 100% of the recipes use Pilsner. The next highest was two-row. We had about 38% of the recipes used an American two-row. And 25% used a wheat malt, and 25% used a Vienna malt. And 12% or one recipe used a Golden Promise base malt. If the malt were used, the percentage of the grist that they encompassed was Pilsner used 77% of the malt of the grist, two-row 28.7%, Golden Promise, that one recipe, used 26.7% of the grain bill, Vienna used 15.6%, and wheat used 4.3%. The ranges are pretty wide. Pilsner ranged between 45% of the grist to 100%. Had a couple recipes 100% Pilsner. Two-row ranged between 17.8% and 40.7%. Vienna, this was probably the biggest one. One recipe used 1.1% and one used 30%. So big, wide, flat curve for Vienna. Wheat used between 2.3% and 6.3%, and Golden Promise had no range because it was one recipe that used 26%. You can see it all on this graph over here. Specialty malts. The big curve here at the top, 62.5% of the recipes used Carapils in some form or fashion. 25% used a light crystal, Carahel, Crystal 10, Crystal 20, something along those lines. And one recipe used Melanoidin. If the malt were used, Carapils was used as an average of 4.9% of the grist. Light crystal, an average of 3.1% of the grist. And Melanoidin was 2%. And the ranges you can see here, I won't repeat them, but pretty tightly grouped together. We've got a small scale here on the bottom between 0 and 10%. Hops used, pretty much bittering and flavor. 100% of the recipes used bittering and flavor hops, and I think 75% used aroma hops, and something like, 35% used Whirlpool hops. One recipe was dry hopped, and that was an outlier. I don't recommend to dry hop this style. Most of the guys that sent me recipes said do not dry hop this style, so that's something I would stay away from. This is a new chart. I haven't presented it before, kind of showing where the IBUs are coming from. It kind of tells you if you're late hopping or put most of your hops at the beginning. So it kind of shows 17 IBUs or was the average from the bittering hops. 9 IBUs from the flavor and aroma hops. So you're seeing a bigger contribution or a bigger amount of hop matter going in, later in the boil. And then 16 IBUs from Whirlpool hops, so a big punch there going in the end of Whirlpool hops. Kind of follows along with this chart, which shows the hop rates for each of the additions, and this one goes flavor to dry hops. I didn't include bitter because bittering hops, I'm just counting the IBUs for those. Flavor hops were around 0.14 ounces per gallon or 1 gram per liter. Aroma hops 0.24 ounces per gallon, 1.8 grams per liter. Whirlpool hops 0.29 ounces per gallon. You can see they're increasing as we go. You can see the numbers going up here. Whirlpool hops 0.29 ounce per gallon or 2.2 grams per liter, and the dry hop over here 0.53 ounces per gallon or 4 grams per liter. This is the number of recipes that used them. You can see 100% used the flavor hop additions, and they decreased as you went on. Based upon this, I would not dry hop and just use these 3 as well as the bittering addition in my recipe. So what kind of bittering hops were used in these styles? A big proportion of them are Motueka, Nelson Sauvin, and Magnum. I assume Magnum was used just because of its clean bittering properties. But pretty much all of them except Magnum were New Zealand varieties, which fits the style. The flavor hops, 50% of the recipes use Nelson Sauvin in combination with some other hops. You can see this piece of the pie is not 50% of the pie chart. So people were combining hops, but Nelson Sauvin was the predominant flavor hop used, and next was Motueka, as well as some other varieties here. You'll see some experimental varieties used by one of the brewers who won them at NHC, so he had to use them somehow, so he threw them in this beer. Obviously it worked for him because he won gold with his New Zealand Pilsner. Kind of throw those out, keep within the style, stay within the New Zealand hops, and it looks like it's doing well. Aroma hops, this is where Motueka kind of shines. 50% of the recipes use Motueka and 38 Nelson Sauvin. They are all New Zealand hop varieties, 100%. So when you get later in the boil, stick to those New Zealand hops. Whirlpool and dry hops. 1/3 of the recipes use Whirlpool hops and significantly use Nelson Sauvin and Motueka again. Others were one-offs in single recipes. And there's only one recipe that used dry hop, and it was Nelson Sauvin. So again, hop analysis, taking all of the flavor descriptors that each one of these hop varieties has. I have weighted it this time by how often that hop was used, so that you can kind of get a see of what profiles you're trying to get out of these hops. The number one was citrus, followed by stone fruit and tropical. These are the three notes you're going to want to try to hit with this recipe or with this style. You can see a lot of other citrus notes in here: lime, orange, tangerine, and stone fruit as well with mango, and a little bit of floral. You really don't want that herbal, earthy, piney character with this style of beer. You want to stick to the New World citrus, stone fruit, and tropical notes to really make it stand out. As far as yeast, a clear favorite here, German lager strain, White Labs 830. Some others were used, Czech Pils, Mexican lager, Diamond lager, Bohemian lager. Lager yeast, there's not a lot of variation in my view. Some people will argue that. I think if you stick to a clean lager strain, you're going to get what you want, but you can't do wrong with using 3470. This is the Weihenstephaner lager strain, or 2206. Water profiles, you can see on that chart, if I tried to explain it to you, it would be very difficult, so I came up with a table here. They were all over the map. This, what is this, sulfate curve, the yellow curve, it varied from almost nothing to 200 parts per million. So the averages here: calcium 54, magnesium 6, sodium 20, sulfate 99, chloride 64, and carbonate 55. I think you stay somewhere in the balanced realm or balanced range here, you're going to do well. I might bump down the sulfate a little bit just because it was so skewed by that one data point out there in the 200s. Kind of bring it in line to be equal to chlorides, and you'll see that in my recipe at the end. Mash type, 1/3 of the mashes used step mashes, and we'll go into that in a second. So here are the mashed rests. There were seven of the 8 recipes reported their mash schedule. They all did a saccharification rest at around 150 degrees. You can see the lowest was 147, the highest was 158. If you throw out the 158 and 147, you get into the high 140s, which when I come up with my recipe, it will be in that area. One recipe did a protein rest because there was wheat included, I think. And one recipe did a beta and then an alpha rest. I wouldn't do these. It seems like a single infusion mash is working well, obviously, because people are winning with it. And somewhere in the high 140s, low 150s is the right temperature there. One recipe actually said that they do an overnight mash. So they brew in a bag and they have a rims type system and basically set it and forget it overnight and come back in the morning and sparge and boil their wort. So obviously with the low temperatures, they're wanting to make a very dry beer, which is something that I would recommend here. The boil duration right at 60-minute average with a low of of 30 minutes and a high of 90. I would recommend staying just at the 60, unless you're doing a decoction, which I would reduce the boil if you can. Fermentation temperature, average was 50 degrees F, 10 C. The range was between 45 and 54. I don't think that there's a big difference between any of these temperatures as far as the cleanliness you're going to get out of the beer. Carbonation, 2 of the beer recipes reported 2.3 volumes of carbonation, so you should shoot for that. And finally, my suggested recipe. Well, this one's been a fast one. I would stick to the 75-25% base malts of Pilsner malt and American Pale malt. I think you need that little bit more flavorful American Pale, a little bit darker, just to give you some extra backbone to compete against those extra hop flavors that you're bringing on. I recommend Irix Pilsner malt. You can get it at txbrewing.com. And Copeland Pale from Skagit Valley Malting, fantastic 2-row. I'd recommend that as well. Add in about 4.85% Carapils, because that was a prominent malt used in almost all the recipes. I'm going to bitter with 17 IBUs of Magnum, just to give me that clean, crisp bittering without any harshness to it. For my later hop additions, I'm going to use, again, the Flavor, Aroma, and Whirlpool hops, and I'm going to stick with Motueka and Nelson Sauvin. And I kind of showed how many IBUs they should contribute, or how many ounces per gallon or grams per liter I'm going to add at each one of those additions. I'm going to shoot for an IBU of 1.050, or an OG of 1.050, and an IBUs of about 41, 42, somewhere around that realm. For my water, I want to keep my sulfate and chloride levels. Again, I talked about this. I want to keep them about the same at 60. Sodium's a little high, but this was the average, and 50 parts per million calcium to help with flocculation and beer stone. I'm going to do a single infusion mash at 60 minutes at 148. Again, I said I'm going to err on the low side of that average. Sparge as usual. I'm going to chill it to 48 degrees, which is 8.9 Celsius. I'm going to oxygenate and pitch a massive starter. So I'm probably going to do a 5-liter starter. I'm going to let it free rise to 50. And when fermentation slows, then I'm going to let it free rise again to 55 and hold for a week. After that, I'll rack to a keg or a bottle and carbonate to 2.3 volumes, like the style says. All right, that concludes our presentation. Let's pick our next style. So if I pick it, Belgian triple. This is right in my wheelhouse. All right, so thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to please subscribe, hit like, hit the notification bell. I enjoy doing this. This was a fun time reaching out to all these brewers and hearing how they came up with their recipes for this style. Again, please subscribe, and we'll see you again next week.